The fourth client email arrived on a Friday afternoon. Polite, professional, the standard language of a business relationship concluding without drama. Thank you for everything. Moving in a different direction. Wish you well. I read it. Then I opened the previous three. Same tone, different words, same result. For major clients in 22 days. I sat with that for a moment. Then I started looking at the timing. When each client relationship had shifted. When the contact patterns had changed. When the warmth that had characterized those relationships for years had quietly cooled. All of it pointing to the same 6-month window. The 6 months before Daniel resigned. I called my lawyer that evening. Not because I had proof yet. Because the pattern was too specific to be coincidence. And because if I was right about what had happened, the contract Daniel had signed 3 years earlier was about to become the most important document in my business. But to understand what that contract protected, you need to know what I had built before Daniel ever walked through the door. 8 years is a long time to build something. Long enough that the early stages start to feel like they happened to a different person. Someone younger and less certain and operating on instinct more than knowledge. I started the consultancy with 2 clients and a home office. Both clients came from my previous employment. People who had worked with me directly and trusted what I could do based on direct experience rather than a portfolio or a reputation I hadn't yet built. That is how most consultancies start. Not with a grand launch. With 2 people who believe in you before anyone else has reason to. The early years were the years of proving the belief was warranted. Every deliverable treated as if the entire business depended on it. Because in the early years it does. One client's experience becomes a referral or it doesn't. One project's outcome becomes a case study or it becomes a lesson. The margin between building something real and building something that quietly collapses is not talent alone. It is the consistency of execution over enough time that trust accumulates into something durable. I was consistent, not because I had extraordinary discipline, because I understood clearly that the consultancy's value was entirely dependent on what clients experienced, that there was no product to fall back on, no brand equity that existed independently of the quality of the work, just the work, and the relationships the work produced. By year 3, the business had grown beyond what I could manage alone, not struggling to manage, genuinely beyond. More client work than one person could deliver at the standard the clients deserved. That is a good problem. It is also a consequential one, because hiring the wrong person at that stage doesn't just cost you the hire. It costs you the client relationships you give them access to. And client relationships are the entire asset base of a consultancy. I was careful about the hire, more careful than I had been about most decisions in the business. Interviewed 6 people over 2 months. Not just assessing capability, assessing character. The specific combination of competence and integrity that a role with deep client access requires. Daniel stood out from the first conversation. Not just sharp, genuinely interested in the work. The kind of interest that is visible in the questions someone asks rather than in the answers they give. He asked about client outcomes. About what made the difference between engagements that produced real change and ones that produced reports that sat on shelves. About how I thought about the relationship between technical quality and client trust. Good questions. Questions that told me he understood what the work was actually for. I hired him, brought him in carefully, introduced him to clients in a measured sequence. The less complex relationships first. Building his exposure to the more significant ones as he demonstrated that the early relationships were being handled well. He handled them exceptionally, not just competently, with the specific quality that clients notice and remember. The feeling of being genuinely attended to, of having their situation understood rather than just processed, of working with someone who cared about the outcome as much as they did. That quality is not something you can train directly. You can create the conditions for it. You can hire for the indicators of it. But the thing itself either exists in a person or it doesn't. In Daniel it existed, and I had trusted it completely. I began thinking of him as a future partner in a genuine sense, not as a retention strategy, as a real possibility, someone who had earned a deeper stake in what we were building. I mentioned it to him at his 2-year review, said that if the trajectory continued, I wanted to have a serious conversation about a partnership structure. He received it with what looked like genuine appreciation, said it meant a lot, said he was committed to what we were building together, said together deliberately. I noted it, filed it as evidence of the alignment I had believed was real. I was not wrong that it had once been real. I was wrong about how long it stayed real, and about what was running underneath the surface during the 6 months before he resigned. Daniel's resignation came on a Monday morning. He asked for a private meeting, sat down across from me with the particular composure of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say enough times that the delivery is clean. He said he'd been offered an opportunity he felt he couldn't turn down, that he had given it significant thought, that he was genuinely grateful for everything the consultancy had given him, for the trust one had placed in him, for the access and the development and the partnership conversation at his last review. He said leaving was not a reflection of anything wrong with what we had built, just the pull of a specific opportunity at a specific moment in his career. He gave a month's notice, offered to do everything possible to ensure a smooth transition, said he would brief me thoroughly on every client relationship, would be available for handover conversations, would do the professional thing in every respect. I received it the way you receive something you didn't see coming, but that you have no immediate reason to challenge. With professional composure, I thank him for telling me directly, said I was disappointed, but that I understood, that the partnership conversation had been genuine and I was sorry the timing hadn't aligned. We shook hands, and the month's notice began. The notice period was normal on the surface. Daniel completed the work in front of him, attended the client meetings on his schedule, participated in the handover conversations he had offered, conducted himself exactly as he had said he would, professionally, graciously, without any visible indication that anything beyond what had been described was happening. On his last day, I thanked him again, said the door was open if circumstances ever changed. Meant it. He left with the same composure he had carried throughout, and I began the work of restructuring without him. The first client email came 11 days later, a relationship I had held for 6 years. Polite, brief, moving in a different direction. I noted it, told myself these things happen. Relationships end. Clients change priorities. The timing was coincidental. The second email came a week after that. Different client. Same tone. Same result. I noted it again. Filed it alongside the first. Began to feel the specific unease of someone who is not yet certain, but is no longer comfortable with coincidence as the explanation. The third came 4 days later. By the third, I had stopped explaining it away. By the third, I was looking at the pattern rather than the individual incidents. And the pattern had a shape that coincidence could not account for. 3 major clients, 22 days, all relationships that Daniel had been the primary contact on, all of them ending without a specific complaint, without a conversation, without any of the signals that normally precede a client relationship concluding. Just polite emails, professionally worded, moving elsewhere. I started reviewing the client communication records, going back through the previous 6 months, looking at the contact patterns between Daniel and these clients. What I found took several hours to piece together. And when it was pieced together, the picture was clear. Daniel had spent his final 6 months at the consultancy doing something systematic, not visible in any single communication, visible in the pattern of them. He had increased his direct contact with the major clients significantly. I've been meeting some of them separately from the scheduled project work. Coffee meetings, informal calls, the kind of contact that builds personal relationship rather than professional relationship, that shifts the client's sense of where the value lives, from the consultancy to the individual, from the company they had hired to the person within it they had come to trust. He had also been saying things, not crudely, not in ways that would have been immediately recognizable as undermining, in the way that someone who understands how trust works undermines it, by raising questions rather than making accusations, by expressing concern rather than criticism, by being the person who seemed to have the client's interests most at heart, while positioning himself as the continuity they needed to protect. I found one email that made the full picture explicit, a message to a client written 2 months before his resignation, expressing hope that the relationship would continue regardless of what happened with his career, that the client's work deserved consistent attention from someone who truly understood it, that he would always be available to them, whatever his circumstances. The message stopped just short of solicitation, just far enough back from the line to be deniable as a general expression of professional commitment, but close enough to the line that its purpose was unmistakable. I printed that email, added it to the file I was building, and called my lawyer. My lawyer's name was Ms. Adeyemi. She had drafted Daniel's employment contract 3 years earlier, which meant she knew exactly what was in it. And when I described what I had found, she asked me to come in the following morning with everything I had gathered. I spent that evening continuing the review, going back further through the records, building the most complete picture I could before the meeting. What I found extended the timeline. The systematic contact building had not started 2 months before his resignation. It had started closer to 6 months before. The earlier instances were subtler, less direct. The particular initial moves of someone who is beginning a process and is being careful about how visibly it begins. A slightly warmer tone in client communications. More personal references. Questions about the client situation that went beyond the scope of the immediate work. The small investments in personal connection that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. I documented everything chronologically. The earliest instance I could identify, the subsequent escalation, the separate meetings, the informal calls, the email that had stopped just short of explicit solicitation, the resignation, the client departures, all of it laid out in sequence. By the time I had finished, it was past midnight. I sat back and looked at what I had assembled. The picture it produced was not ambiguous. Daniel had decided to leave the consultancy and take its clients with him, had made that decision approximately 6 months before his resignation, had spent those 6 months methodically preparing the ground, building direct personal relationships with every major client, shifting their sense of where the value resided, creating the conditions for them to follow him when he left, all while continuing to perform his role at the standard that had made him trusted, all while participating in the partnership conversation at his 2-year review with apparent genuine appreciation, all while conducting his notice period with the professional grace that had left me with nothing to challenge at the time. The performance of it was the part that landed hardest in that late evening. Not the betrayal exactly, the sustained nature of it. 6 months of daily choices to continue doing what he was doing, to maintain the presentation of loyalty and commitment and appreciation, while systematically dismantling the foundation of the thing he had been trusted to help build. I went to bed without fully processing it. Some things need sleep before they can be approached with the right kind of clarity. I saw Ms. Adeyemi the following morning, placed a folder on her desk, walked her through what I had found. She read carefully, asked specific questions about the timeline, about the client communication records and how they had been obtained, about the nature of the separate meetings and what documentation existed of them. I answered everything she asked. She pulled up Daniel's contract while I was talking. I watched her read the relevant sections, the non-solicitation clause, the confidentiality provisions, the specific language about client relationships and the obligations that applied to them during and after employment. She had drafted those clauses. She knew what they said and what they were designed to address. When she looked up, her expression was the specific expression of a lawyer who has just assessed a situation and found it clearly in their client's favor. She said the contract was well constructed for exactly this situation, that the non-solicitation clause covered direct and indirect approaches to clients. That the pattern I had documented constituted a systematic indirect approach that fell squarely within the clause's scope. That the email I had found was significant. Not quite explicit solicitation, but close enough that combined with the pattern of contact, it supported a strong inference of intent. She said the case was not just viable. It was strong. Strong enough that the realistic outcome was either a settlement that served my interests substantially or a court finding that did the same. She asked what outcome I wanted. I told her clearly. The clients returned. Damages for the period of disruption and loss. An injunction preventing Daniel from approaching any of my clients for the remainder of the non-solicitation period. And whatever reputational consequences naturally followed from the legal process being on the record. She said all of those outcomes were achievable. Then she said something that I want to be honest about because it mattered to how I thought about the situation. She said the process would be unpleasant, not legally difficult, personally unpleasant. That pursuing a former employee through a legal process requires a sustained commitment to an adversarial situation with someone you had trusted and invested in. That the emotional cost of that was real and worth acknowledging before committing to it. I told her I had acknowledged it. That the acknowledgement had not changed my position. That what Daniel had done had caused real damage to something I had built over 8 years. That allowing it to stand without consequence would be a disservice to the business and to everyone who depended on it. She nodded, said she understood, and began preparing the legal claim. The claim was filed within 2 weeks of my first meeting with Ms. Adeyemi. She had moved quickly because the situation required it. Every day that passed was another day Daniel's new venture was operating with client relationships he had taken in violation of his contract. Every day was another day those clients were settling into a new arrangement rather than being recovered to their previous one. Speed mattered. Not reckless speed, deliberate speed. The kind that comes from being prepared before you move, rather than rushing, because the situation feels urgent. We were prepared. The documentation was thorough. The legal foundation was clear. The claim was filed correctly and completely. Daniel received it through his legal representation. I found out through Ms. Adeyemi that he had retained a lawyer quickly, within days of the claim being served, which told me something, not about guilt specifically, about preparation. Someone who retains legal representation that quickly in response to a claim has either been expecting the claim or has been advised by someone who understood the exposure well enough to anticipate it. Either way, it told me the situation was being taken seriously on his side, which meant the documentation had done what documentation is supposed to do, made the position clear enough that the other party understood immediately what they were facing. Daniel's initial legal position was the standard one: denial of the claim's substance, argument that the contact with clients had been within normal professional relationship maintenance, that the non-solicitation clause was too broadly drafted to be enforceable as applied, that the clients had made their own decisions to move their business independently of any approach by Daniel. Ms. Adeyemi had expected each of these arguments, had prepared the responses before they arrived. The normal professional relationship maintenance argument collapsed against the documented timeline. 6 months of systematically elevated personal contact with every major client simultaneously was not normal relationship maintenance. It was a coordinated preparation for departure. The documentation showed that clearly. The broad drafting argument had limited merit given the specific language of the clause. Ms. Adeyemi had written it to be specific precisely to avoid the standard enforceability challenges. The clients made their own decisions argument was the strongest of the three. Because, technically true, no client had been forced to move. Each had made their own choice. But choice made in the context of systematic influence is not the same as choice made independently. And the documentation showed the context in which the choices had been made. The separate meetings, the personal contact building, the email that expressed hope the relationship would continue regardless of his circumstances. The choices had been engineered, not forced, but engineered. And the engineering was what the non-solicitation clause existed to prevent. Ms. Adeyemi presented the full response to Daniel's legal team with the documentation attached. The response to that was slower than the initial defense, which was again information. I was learning to read the pace of the legal process as a signal. Fast responses meant confidence. Slow responses meant reassessment. The slow response meant Daniel's legal team was looking at the documentation and calculating the distance between his position and what the evidence supported. That distance was significant, and calculating it was taking time. I went back to running the business during this period. Not easily. The loss of the major clients had created a real gap. Revenue down. Team utilization affected. The particular operational disruption of a business that has lost a significant portion of its client base in a short period. I managed it, not by pretending the disruption wasn't real, by being honest with the team about the situation, telling them what had happened in the terms I could share, that a former employee had taken client relationships in breach of his contract, that legal action was underway, that the outcome was expected to recover the position, that in the meantime, we would manage carefully and I would keep them informed. They appreciated the directness. Not all of them stayed. One person left during that period. Timing that may have been coincidence. May not have been. I noted it. Didn't pursue it. The others stayed. Continued working. Continued delivering for the clients who remained. Continued being the team that the consultancy's reputation was built on. That continuity mattered, because the legal process was going to take the time it took, and the business needed to still be the business when it concluded. I also used the period to do something I should have done earlier. I reviewed every other client relationship, directly, called each one personally, not to ask whether they were considering leaving, to invest in the relationship in a specific personal way that I had delegated to Daniel and had not been doing myself sufficiently. Several of those calls produced conversations I was glad I had. Context about what the clients valued, what they needed more of, what they had found sometimes missing. Honest feedback from people who appreciated being asked directly by the person running the business rather than through an intermediary. I should have been having those conversations all along. The situation had forced me to have them, and the relationships that came out of those conversations were stronger than they had been before, which was the specific irony of what Daniel had attempted in trying to take the clients by making himself indispensable. He had revealed the gap in how I had been managing them, and closing that gap made the remaining relationships more resilient than they had been when he was the one maintaining them. The settlement conversation began about 6 weeks after the claim was filed. Daniel's legal team indicated their client was open to a mediated resolution. Ms. Adeyemi said it was the right moment to be precise about what resolution required, that the opening of a settlement conversation was not a concession. It was an invitation to negotiate, and the starting position I took into that negotiation would shape everything that followed. She asked me to be specific about what I needed the outcome to contain. I told her. The clients returned, not approached and persuaded. Formally returned through whatever communication was required to make the transition clean and complete. Damages for the revenue lost during the period of disruption, calculated specifically against the client billings that had moved and the period they had been absent. The injunction. Full enforcement of the remaining non-solicitation period. No contact with any of my clients. No approach direct or indirect, for the duration specified in the agreement. And a formal acknowledgement of the breach. Not a public statement. A documented acknowledgement within the legal process that the non-solicitation clause had been violated. Something on the record. That last element was the one Ms. Adeyemi said Daniel's team would push back on most, because an acknowledged breach had implications beyond the immediate settlement, for his professional reputation, for future employment conversations, for anyone who subsequently did due diligence on his background. She was right that they pushed back on it. The settlement negotiation took 3 weeks, not because the facts were in dispute. They weren't. because each element of the resolution had to be agreed separately, and the acknowledged breach element required the most work. Daniel's team argued for language that described the matter as resolved without admitting the specific nature of the breach. Ms. Adeyemi held the position. She said the acknowledgement was not punitive. It was accurate, that a resolution language which obscured what had actually happened was not a resolution. It was a cover, and the documentation we had made a cover unnecessary and inadvisable. Because if Daniel subsequently behaved in a similar way toward another employer, and that employer investigated his history, the absence of a clear record would allow the same thing to happen again. The presence of one would make it significantly harder. That framing shifted the conversation, not because Daniel's team suddenly embraced it, because it made the argument for obscuring the breach look like exactly what it was: a request to protect someone's ability to do the same thing again, which was not a request Ms. Adeyemi was going to accommodate. The final settlement contained everything I had asked for. The clients were formally returned, not all of them immediately. The legal process of unwinding their arrangements with Daniel's new venture took different amounts of time for different clients. But each one came back. The damages figure was meaningful, calculated against actual revenue loss rather than an arbitrary sum. Ms. Adeyemi had been specific in the calculation methodology, and the result reflected the actual cost of what the breach had produced. The injunction was granted for the full remaining non-solicitation period. No contact, no approach. Any violation of the injunction would immediately reopen the legal situation with the full weight of the settlement already on the record. And the acknowledgement was there. Specific language in the settlement documentation confirming that the non-solicitation clause had been breached, that the breach had been systematic and had occurred over a period of approximately 6 months, that the settlement had been reached in recognition of that breach, not concealed, not softened into something unrecognizable. On the record, accurately, I want to describe what happened to Daniel's new venture, not with satisfaction exactly, with the honest account of what follows when someone builds something on a foundation they had no right to build on. The venture had been structured around the clients he had taken. His value proposition to potential investors and partners had been built on the client base he had established. When the legal process returned those clients to my consultancy, the foundation of what he had been building disappeared. Not gradually, immediately. The clients he had positioned as his proof of concept were no longer his clients. The relationships he had spent 6 months cultivating were legally extracted from the structure he had built around them. What remained was a venture without its primary asset, at the precise moment it needed that asset most, before it had established anything else to stand on. Daniel's new venture did not immediately collapse, but it was crippled in the specific way that businesses are crippled when their founding premise is removed before they have built anything beyond it. It limped forward without the momentum it had needed from the beginning. And in the industry where reputation travels, the manner in which it had started was not invisible. The clients came back over a period of about 6 weeks, not all at once, each relationship requiring its own conversation, its own reestablishment of the terms and the trust and the particular dynamic that had characterized it before Daniel's systematic intervention had redirected it. Those conversations were not comfortable. I want to be honest about that. Some of them required me to acknowledge things I would have preferred not to acknowledge, that I had delegated the maintenance of those relationships more completely than I should have, that the personal connection clients had developed with Daniel had been allowed to become stronger than their connection with the consultancy itself, that the vulnerability he had exploited had existed partly because of how I had structured things, not his creation entirely, his exploitation of a gap I had left open, acknowledging that to clients required a specific kind of honesty, not self-flagellation, not excessive apology, just the direct admission of someone who had examined what had happened and understood their own role in creating the conditions for it. The clients who returned responded to that honesty well, better than they might have responded to a defensive account that placed all responsibility on Daniel. Because honesty about your own gaps demonstrates the same quality of attention that makes a consultancy worth trusting with your business. It shows that you examine things clearly, that you act on what you find rather than managing the presentation of it. Several of the returning clients said something to the effect that the conversation we were having was more direct than most they had with their advisors, that it gave them confidence rather than undermining it. I received that with genuine appreciation and held it as a reminder of what the relationship between a consultancy and its clients should actually be. Not the management of impression, the consistent delivery of honest attention. The business stabilized over the following months. Not quickly, not without cost. The disruption had been real, and the recovery required real work. But the foundation was sound. The team that had stayed were the team worth keeping. The clients who had returned with their eyes open, with a clearer understanding of the consultancy and of me personally than they had perhaps had before. And the relationships that had been rebuilt through that clarity were more durable than the ones that had preceded them. I made several changes in the aftermath, not reactively, deliberately. The client relationship model was restructured. Every significant client relationship maintained with my direct involvement rather than delegated entirely. Not because I didn't trust the team, because I understood now what I had not fully understood before. That the relationship between a consultancy and its clients is the consultancy's primary asset. And primary assets require primary attention, not just oversight, direct personal investment from the person whose name is on the door. The employment contracts were reviewed. Ms. Adeyemi went through every clause, identified elements that could be strengthened, tightened the language in areas that Daniel's situation had revealed could be read more broadly than intended, added specific provisions about the building of personal client relationships during employment, about what constituted preparation for competitive activity during a notice period, about the documentation obligations on employees during their final months in the role. Not punitive additions, precise ones. The specific precision that comes from understanding exactly what you are protecting against because you have seen what it looks like when you are not protected against it. I also changed how I thought about hiring, not cynically, more carefully. The qualities I had valued in Daniel were real qualities. The intelligence, the client instinct, the ability to build relationships. Those things had made him genuinely valuable. They had also made him capable of the precise damage he had done. I had hired for capability without adequately examining character. Not because I was careless, because I had not fully understood that capability and character require separate assessment. That someone can be genuinely good at the work and genuinely willing to use that goodness in ways you did not intend and did not protect against. The protection against that is not suspicion. It is structure, clear agreements, documented expectations, relationships maintained directly rather than through intermediaries. The particular vigilance of someone who understands that the most capable person in a business is also the person with the most ability to damage it, and who structures accordingly, without making the structure feel like distrust. The consultancy is stronger now than it was before Daniel, not despite what happened, partly because of it, because the gaps it revealed were gaps that needed to be addressed, and the addressing of them produced something more resilient than what existed before. I think about Daniel occasionally, not with ongoing anger. The anger had a natural lifespan, and it concluded somewhere in the settlement process. What I feel when I think about him now is something more considered, a recognition of genuine talent used in a direction it should not have been used, of capability that could have produced something real if the character behind it had matched the quality of the work. He had built something during those 6 months, not just the client relationships, the operational thinking required to execute what he executed, the patience to do it across 6 months without detection, The specific intelligence of someone who understood exactly which levers to pull. All of that in service of something that was dismantled by a contract clause and 8 months of careful documentation. The waste of it is what I notice most. Not my loss, his waste of real ability directed at the wrong thing, producing an outcome that damaged him more substantially than it damaged me. Because my losses were recoverable, his were structural. The venture built on a foundation that was legally removed, the professional reputation in an industry where these things travel. The acknowledged breach on the record, all of it following from a decision made 6 months before his resignation, when he looked at what we were building together and decided to take it rather than continue building it. That decision said something about him that no amount of ability could speak against, and the industry had heard it clearly. The most expensive thing you can take from someone who built something carefully is not the thing itself. It is their trust in the judgment they used to build it. Protect what you built with the right agreements, the right structure, and the right level of direct attention to what matters most. If this story resonated with you, the importance of the contract, the documentation, the direct attention to what you cannot afford to lose, leave in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.